and an author. You can find me at mattrubycomedy.com, at mattruby on Twitter, RubyMatt on Instagram, and I have a newsletter called the Rubes Letter that you can sign up for at mattruby.substack.com. And I am joined today by Professor Christopher Kelly, Professor of Buddhism. What else should we know about you?
Well, I think it's important to say I am a part-time professor, and I am truly part-time and proud of it in the sense that I am technically not full professor, but I am also now the proud part owner of a retail space in Middle Valley, which makes me a small business owner, as well as one of the co-founders of Psychedelic Sangha, which is a small community business philanthropic enterprise that focuses on psychedelic integration and exploration. So gotcha. Only one part of that is professor.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's interesting. How do you feel about the professor title? Is it something that I feel like, is it still as respected as it ever was? Do you like to work it into conversation? I'm thinking of that op-ed in the New York or Wall Street Journal where that said Jill Biden shouldn't call herself a doctor because she's never delivered a baby. And like, how does the professor title work into your life?
Well, I've never delivered a baby, but I've delivered a dissertation, and I can tell you how much that fucking hurts and costs. And it's a lot, it's in the ballpark of a baby.
A lot of deep breathing required in both.
So I definitely feel like I've birthed something, and in that sense, I deserve something. I don't know, I have fun with my doctorate. I like to call myself Doc Kelly. It's kind of like, Doc Holliday or something. And it's something, getting a PhD is really a wonderful privilege. And I did it at a place where I could study with a guy, who was like a very abnormal professor, kind of the mad psychedelic professor, and that's Bob Thurman. And he, that whole experience was really wonderful. And so for me, like calling myself doc and being a PhD is more about having had that experience and treasuring it, and savoring it as such a privilege, really.
Great. And, we've been talking about the overlap between Buddhism and dark comedy for a few years now, and we'll even be collaborating on a class that you're teaching upcoming this summer called Buddhism or Dark Comedy and Buddhism. And I actually have the course description that we were kind of going back and forth on, so I thought I'd read that because I think it's kind of a good framework for the conversation We're about to have. So the Buddha and stand-up comedians agree, life is suffering. Comedians like George Carlin and Richard Pryor got guffaws by exploring dark existential thoughts. Meanwhile, Larry David, Gary Shandling, and Tig Notaro have shown us how being awkward, neurotic, and dissatisfied creates fertile ground for laughter. It turns out dark comedy can serve as a great introduction to Buddhist concepts such as dukkha, which means existential angst, and anicca, which means impermanence. The course we're teaching will explore that connection and show how much comedians surprisingly have in common with Zen masters and Tibetan lamas. Some questions we'll explore. Why do we laugh at the human condition in one context and not another? What's the relationship between Buddhist realism and dark comedy? And what can we learn about classic Buddhist texts by studying classic comedy bits? Students will encounter the foundational ideas of Buddhism through a close reading of Buddhist texts alongside comedy performances, shows, and movies. So I love that description. I feel like it gets into what I want to cover today. When I read that to you, is there anything that stands out that you feel is like the core of the idea, or is it all equally relevant?
The thing that ever since you and I met, which was ages and ages ago at the Rubin Museum, and I was first beginning to sort of probe this topic, largely because of having had the experience of it working in class. It really worked in class to play comedic bits that I felt were addressing, it was dark comedy, but to my eyes, it was addressing some truths that we talk about in Buddhism. And so for me, it started with this neat trick that I could play on my students, where we all watch Louis C.K. and they suddenly understand Buddhism, and I was really curious, like, why is that? Like, why is it funny when Louis talks about death and not funny when Thich Nhat Hanh talks about death, and why is it that the Dalai Lama laughs so much? Is there some connection between laughter and enlightenment? And, so all these were sort of questions that were coming up after having discovered the connection, after having discovered that there was something very palpable and tangible, connecting dark comedy and Buddhism. And so, what I discovered and what's kind of stuck with me is really that sort of big question, like, why do we even laugh at this shit? Like, why is it funny when Louis C.K. tells the room, jam-packed Beacon Theater, that a certain percentage of them are going to surely die before Christmas. Like, that's just not funny in of itself, but everybody's laughing. So, like, why is that? And what I discovered was not my own discovery, but something that is written up in books about theories of humor, and it's this idea of incongruency. It's like a philosophical theory of humor, and we laugh at incongruency, and there's more to it than that, but like the stock example is like, clowns piling out of a small car, or like Chris Farley doing his fat guy in a little coat bit, where he rips the coat. This tension between two incongruent things, fat guy in a little coat, lots of clowns coming out of a little car.
An example that I love, which is a comedy trope, is the high status moron. So if you go back to Steve Martin's stand-up, where he would be talking as if he was super intellectual and polished and impressive, and everything he's saying is like the thoughts of a moron, and that clashing is where the funniness is. And Chris Farley, another great one, is the Chippendales sketch on SNL, where it's him and Patrick Swayze auditioning to be Chippendales, and it's so clearly a visual absurd thing that you can't help but laugh at it.
Totally. And in the context of dark comedy, I think the incongruity is between the way we see ourselves in our own minds, the way we see the world filtered through our own egos, and the way it actually exists. So it's like, I'm never going to die. I can laugh at Louis' joke because it's going to be that guy next to me, not me. This is like complete incongruency between the reality and the inner sort of experience of that reality.
Yeah, I think a couple of things that ping in my brain when you talk about that is there's also the context of how rarely we address the stuff in our society, how afraid of death we are, how we never talk about it, how it's this taboo subject that we kind of like push off to the periphery if we even encounter it in any way, and how that is also, any comedian will tell you, that is fertile soil for comedy. If there's something that is everywhere and that we're not talking about, then that's like there's this built-in tension waiting to erupt, which is like a huge part of comedy, and laughter is tension that is punctured. And I know you mentioned the one Buddhist teacher who is not funny, but it is interesting to me sometimes when I listen to lectures by Osho or Ram Dass, they get a lot of laughs. There's definitely moments in, and I think a lot of it comes from that tension of like, everyone's like, oh, this is a very serious thing. This person is a guru. This is like, we must all be like focused and intent. And then when that person on that stage is like, yeah, but this is also a little bit silly and absurd. And like, I'm going to take a 10-second pause and then just say something ridiculous. And that room erupts in laughter in a way that's always intriguing to me.
Yeah, and I think laughter is, a sign of some kind of tolerance for uncertainty. It's like you are able to experience life in a way that allows you to see the inherent humor in everything, the incongruencies in everything,
Yeah, It's comedy is a way of looking at the world sometimes. Like comedians will tell you this, like you could be going through like the worst experience, of your life, or something awful is happening, but in the back of your mind, you're like, I'm going to get good material out of this. Nora Ephron, I think, has that line about how everything is copy. And I think, comedians can relate to that, of like, sometimes they'll just go out and do weird stuff just to generate material.
Weird stuff to generate material. That's kind of, I should put that in my profile.
Go for it. So, yeah, and I think, well, let's talk about, some of the stuff that you've written about Buddhism and dark comedy. And one of the things you said was they're both a form of abnormal discourse in how they both seek to expose unsettling truths about the human condition and thereby disrupt or subvert a pernicious cognitive tendency to deny such truths through epistemic incongruity. You sound like a professor there, I got to say. There's a lot of big words. Pernicious, cognitive, and epistemic.
That's a lot of bunk. But I think the essence of that is that there's this idea of abnormal discourse, and it's any kind of discourse, or discourse in this sense, meaning like things that comedians are saying on stage. And in this case, it's things that disrupt that, or you might say expose that incongruency, that inherent incongruency. So the disruption, is really just a disruption of a false sense of congruency, that everything is the way it's the disruption of this false sense of compatibility between your outer world and your inner world, right? And I think that's what dark comedy seeks to do. That's what Buddhism seeks to do. I think that's what psychedelics can help you do, as well as meditation. And it's interesting to think about the connection there between meditation, psychedelics, and comedy, because I think those are probably the three things that connect you and me most. If we were to do like one of those sort of friendship charts, like we would both score in those three categories, very high.
Yeah, and there's more and more research coming out about the overlap between meditation and psychedelics. So I think those things are aligned in a lot of ways. It's interesting because I like most comedians I don't think of as being like Zen in that sort of chill meditation kind of notion, the way we think about it. Yet I do think there's, especially being on stage, there's something about that being in the moment of, you can go up there with your scripted material for how you want to deliver it. But the whole reason you're doing it in a room in front of a group of people is because it's not just on TV. It's not just the same thing night after night. There's some energy exchange, and it's almost your job as a comedian to sometimes be willing to go off the script and deal with that feeling in the room in the moment. And you can do the exact same joke 2 different nights the exact same way, and one night it kills and one night it bombs, and you're like, what happened? And that's in a way forcing you into that I would say somewhat of a Zen state of mind, of being in the moment and in the present, and kind of living in that reality, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things for people who haven't sunk their teeth into the diversity of Buddhism, is they tend, particularly if you're American, because the first wave of Buddhism to hit America's shores was really Zen Buddhism, and so most people have this very Zen-like, conception of Buddhism that may or may not fit with the Tibetan sort of version, which, has this whole idea of crazy wisdom and, tantrikas who fly and do magic and use, strange substances and engage in tantra and do the kinds of, things that you would never commonly associate with spirituality. Like in other words, like, we think of Zen as being like serene and peaceful and spiritual, and this is like, who let Yamantaka in the room that's like this crazy spiritual guy with horns, and it's a roadshow, of deities and practices. And I think what I'm getting at is that it's disruptive, right? And so when we think of Buddhism as being like serene and Buddhists are at peace with the world, like, yeah, that's one flavor of Buddhism, but there's another flavor of Buddhism that is extremely spiritually effective, that does not look like that. That looks a lot more chaotic, that looks a lot more disruptive and dangerous.
And in what way? How is it dangerous?
It's dangerous to that whole congruency thing. It's dangerous. You and I, our course was originally entitled "It's Funny Because It's True," and there's almost like something very threatening about that title, like so the disruption that we've been talking about, the abnormal discourse, the incongruency, is all a way of talking about the experience of what I think a lot of people are calling like being woke now. Being woke, it's like a disassociation from consumer culture. It's a disassociation from your ego. It's a tolerance for the inherent incongruency between your inner world and your outer world, and so for me, Buddhism looks very disruptive. Like if Buddhism looks serene and peaceful to you, maybe you need to practice more or something, because it has that element, but it also has a very dirty, down in the depths, getting into the muck and crazy aspect. It's disruptive. It should feel at times like a bad trip.
Yeah, I think especially if you're living within a Western, capitalist, Judeo-Christian society, like I think if you're doing it right, there's friction there. Like there's going to be like some questioning of your entire life and your values and what you're surrounded by in a way that's like, and for most of us, you're not going to live on a monastery for, months or years is not an option. So, how do you take wherever you're at with that and then interact with the quote unquote real world that's happening, in our society? It can be challenging. And one thing I'll add also is just, I do think that there's, I consider the stage at a comedy club to be a sacred space on some level, or there's something holy about it, in part because of what you're talking about, this the way we talk about everything everywhere else in the world. And then there's this 6-foot little area in this room in a basement where all those rules go out the window. And right here where we are now, we can do this. Now we can talk this way. Now we can bring up these topics that we're not allowed to bring up anywhere else, that could get us fired somewhere else. And the role of a comedian is like, yeah, you can't fire me. This is my whole job, is to say stuff that would get you fired. And there's something about that is what makes it special, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like one of the few truly, free spaces where you can exercise cognitive liberty. You can publicly think whatever you want. And what I mean by publicly think is that it's a inherently public space. Like, you are thinking out loud. The comedian is, the way the space is set up is to facilitate the freedom of whomever has the mic, right? And once that person takes the stage, you are sharing your mind with the people. And in that sense, it is totally open. You are invited to say anything so long as it's funny. That's like the only criteria, right? And that's what I mean by truly free, is that there are very few spaces, I think, where you can do that. One of those spaces, I believe, it was in ancient India when Buddhism first emerged, and it was the forest. And that's where all the weirdos went to go experiment with weird ideas. A similar sort of place might be Burning Man, where people go to experiment with weird ideas and substances. And these are very, you know, we tend to think as Americans, you know, oh, we're so free, we can, you know, storm the Capitol if we want. But that's not freedom, you know. Freedom is being able to exercise your cognitive liberty. And there are not many places where you can do that. Although it's changing now with decriminalization. That's so amazing. Did I lose Matt at 420? Matt? Well, I think we're still going, and it's 420. You know if we do it 420. Too bad Matt left. Are people still watching? Text me if you are. All right, I see somebody said hello. So I guess we're still here. So Matt Ruby seems to have lost his connection, and now it's the Doc Kelly show. I'm exercising my cognitive liberty while Matt gets back online. That was so funny, Matt. We lost you right at 420, and it gave me the opportunity to, you know, exercise my cognitive liberty here and light up a little friend. Sorry you can't be here to enjoy with me, but, you know, COVID's a bitch. Oh, we lost Matt again. Boy, his cannabis karma just isn't here.
All right. I lost you, but I'm back. Did I miss something good?
Nah, you didn't miss anything. Where were we?
Hey, can you hear me? Hello?
I can hear you.
All right, I think we're back. Sorry.
It's all right, we're back. So what were we talking about?
Good question. Where did I lose you? I guess we can pick up from a new topic, unless you recall where we were.
We were talking about cognitive liberty, and you lost your connection at 420, and that's when that's where we parted ways. So that was what happened.
420. There you go. Oh, you were talking about the forest where all the weirdos would go.
Mm-hmm. So I think back in ancient India, the forest was the comedy club.
Interesting. I like the woods.
In that it facilitated it. It was a sacred space for abnormal discourse, for you know, exercising your cognitive liberty, which could either mean engaging in meditation, engaging in yoga, engaging in debate, thought experimentation, and psychedelics.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, as far as comedy clubs too, I feel like a huge part of it is context, that everyone knows that they're there for the purpose of laughter. And that's why they've entered this arena. And I feel like so much of what's happening with social media and in other places is this collapse of context, where like someone who's a comedian might have a line plucked out and then presented as if it's some serious statement and everyone's outraged, and then that person has to get canceled and things like that. And like part of what I love about a comedy club is everyone knows that they're there for that same purpose, and then nothing is no cameras are allowed, nothing can be recorded, nothing can be filmed. And so again, we go back to that sort of Buddhist concept of being in the present moment. And I think that's part of also what makes it special, is that feeling that it's ephemeral or transitory, or like the quote unquote you had to be there. It's like literally you do have to be there, because you ask anyone, watch a special on TV, it's not going to match that experience of actually being in the room as it happens.
Yeah, and I miss that feeling so much, the feeling of being there, you know.
Totally.
Because it's you don't get that, you know. Zoom is like, you know, it's this incredible mediator of like human connection, you know, and it gives you this sort of false sense of connection, but it just leaves you completely flat.
Yeah, yeah, it's virtual reality, literally. Um, okay, so I wanted to bridge to, when we talk about this essential sort of what's at the root of Buddhism, and talking about death and dukkha and the idea of old age and sickness, and the Buddha encountering it. And I know that's where you sort of start your conversations about dark comedy and Buddhism. Why do you begin there?
Well, it's the first noble truth, right? So it's the first thing that the Buddha taught. The first thing he said was all life is dukkha. What is dukkha? Very simple translation is suffering. And then you can get kind of more sophisticated, more nuanced. It's more like dissatisfaction, constant unsatisfactoriness. It can be juxtaposed with sukha, which means happiness. But dukkha, in the Buddhist sense, is said to include happiness, because what we know as happiness is not actually happiness. So that's why everything is dukkha. And that's why there has to be a little bit of nuance, because they're not just saying something very pessimistic. What they're saying is actually quite sophisticated, which is that we oscillate between feelings of good and bad, and that there's a kind of ennui that emerges after a while. It's like Groundhog Day, right? Like you're repeating the same drama over and over, and you're going back through the same sort of, up and down, sukha dukkha, and that is a kind of dukkha, right? But you have a vocabulary problem here, because what they're saying is everything is dukkha, but all you really know is dukkha and sukha. So what we're really saying is you need to look at life differently. You need to kind of disassociate. You need to change the way you're seeing the world. So it's much more about psychology than philosophy. You could make a big philosophical stink, but it's really about shifting the way you experience the world. So they start with this statement about what is. The world is suffering. And they say that wasn't shocking news to his disciples who had already renunciated society. But it is kind of shocking news if you're like a Pollyanna, optimistic American who doesn't like to hear bad news. But that's not what it's saying. It's not pessimism. It's realism. That's Buddhist realism. It's looking at the world and saying, look, yeah, there are good times, there are bad times, but it's always oscillating. It's always changing. And that's what I meant by ennui, is that there's a kind of ennui that emerges from that, a kind of like meta dissatisfaction that at a certain point you're like, maybe I want to get off this train, and that leads into the second noble truth. Like, how do you do that? And it's addressing very specifically how we hold or cling to conceptions and ideas and things. So number two is very much the sort of or identification of what it is that's causing the suffering, right? Something you're doing, it's this clinging to congruency, right? And you were getting at this before, Matt, when we were talking about like how we deny death, that it's this thing that we kind of like push away from us, and so, that's to establish sort of this, facade of congruency. And so, we cling to that facade, we hold to it, and then when it's disrupted, it rattles us. That's COVID's been a great existential disruptor. It's rattled all the foundations of what we cling to as being normal, as being not in the nature of change. So, not to talk too much here, because I feel like I've sort of lost the thread a little bit, but I think we start with suffering because it is how we all, this more nuanced version of suffering is how we all collectively experience the world. And if we can agree on that, then we can start to actually do the psychology and look at the causes of that. And those are the first two things the Buddha taught. And I don't think those are religious. I think those are just very practical, psychological, friendly, things that you can talk about without ever going into religion. 3 and 4, the next two of the Four Noble Truths, I think, are religious.
Interesting. I'll just speak to some of those ideas that arose from what you were saying. Like Rodney Dangerfield is someone who comes to my mind as sort of a Buddha-like figure within stand-up comedy. And there's lots of different ways you can do stand-up comedy. You can be absurdist, you can be a character, you can be a George Carlin type. But to me, Rodney is the sort of the progenitor of that. I get no respect. The self-effacing, here's what's wrong with me, I'm a loser, no one respects me, my wife's cheating on me, my doctor's an idiot, everyone hates me, and that is the origin story and the theme, the umbrella that all his material extends from. And then that's the seed, and then he shows how many branches he can go off from it in a way that I think had deep influence on comedy for decades to follow. And I think speaks to that, sort of idea of like the thing that we don't want to talk about, and how much like power there is in it, and how much also other people find it compelling and interesting to hear about. Because I think it's so like we don't talk about death and push that off to the periphery. In general, that's what we do with our other problems in life too. Like in the common mode of discourse. And I'll give you an example. Like, so I've given sort of speeches or presentations to business groups or tech groups before about humor, and part of what I tell them is about how they have to invert their way of thinking, because in that world it's all about if not braggadocio, it's about building yourself up. I'm a thought leader. Oh, we've made so much money. Oh, we're so important. We have such influence. We're making this difference in the world. We're doing all this wonderful stuff. And I'm like, that shit's boring. That shit is the opposite of comedy. It's the opposite of good stand-up. You want to be funny? Like, what are you bad at? What are you wrong about? What's the thing that people are always like making fun of you about? What's the thing that you're ashamed of? What's something you feel vulnerable about? What's something you're willing to be transparent about that no one else is? Now you've done, because the first step towards getting laughter is getting people's attention. And so like that in itself kind of gets people's attention, because they're like, whoa, this is not how I'm used to hearing people talk. Usually people are like big up in themselves and being like, here's why I'm the best. And this guy just got on stage and is talking about what a loser he is and how no one respects him at all. They're also, it's a line though, because you can do it and have people genuinely feel bad for you, and that's bad for comedy. Like if people are just like, ooh, this guy is like genuinely going through some awful period in his life and I'm worried for him, then you've lost the map a little bit for stand-up. But if you can do it in a way and go there and still be confident and have craft behind it and punchlines, it can be this sort of magical hybrid of like taking people to this sort of dark area or embarrassing area that they don't usually go, and swimming around in it, but then pulling them back out and showing that on the other side there is laughter and that there is acceptance and there's something that's okay about it.
When I think about like the role of a shaman, like I think there is that element to it. And, one of the things that the psychedelic Renaissance has sort of shed light on is the absence of, homegrown shamans. Like we had our dalliance with psychedelics in the 60s, and that was not that long ago. We are a new culture. We are a culture with many, many, many roots, without any single one root. So we don't have that like ready-made, shaman who's had his place in the world, And so my point is that I think that social function has kind of gone into a lot of other places. And one of those places I think is probably the stand-up comedian. And what I mean by that is the ability to guide people, like you said, through that sort of garden of insecurities. And, a good comedian is able to make you laugh and feel certain ways and feel perhaps safe and unsafe, or safe in the unsafeness of it. But whatever it is, they come away, feeling some sort of edification, right? And that makes you a good comedian. That makes you a good shaman, I think.
Yeah, totally. No, I had a bodywork session with a Brazilian shaman once who did like this, for lack of, it was like breath of fire, and then this deep tissue massage, and like my whole body like started cramping up, and then I cried, and then I laughed, and I had this vision of my mom, and the whole thing was like super crazy and intense. And we don't need to go deep dive into it, but I remember afterwards, one of the notions I have being like, it's crazy to me that in our society we separate a therapist, a masseuse, and a priest into 3 different jobs.
Right,
where
totally.
it's like, so clearly this person from the Amazon is like, how would you ever do that? How would you be someone's therapist without putting your hands on their body and feeling where their tension is? And how would you try to help them out of whatever spiritual or intellectual or emotional malaise they're in without doing these things? And like, of course there's singing during therapy. Why wouldn't there be? And massage and all this in a way that's like makes you realize how in our society we're so Western and rational and analytical, and like, well, this person has a degree in this thing, and this person has a degree in this thing, and never the twain shall meet. And realizing like, oh, in like indigenous or native cultures that have been around for thousands of years, there might be a different approach to this. So I wanted to take a moment. We've got some people commenting. Chris Wiegand says hello, and Pablo has given us an award. Thank you, Pablo. And then Donald Brandt is here saying he enjoys mushrooms, as do you and I, and that he is a fan of Doug Stanhope, the stand-up comedian, who I also think is terrific, and have on my list as someone who really embraces this idea of dark comedy and kind of going to places that other people won't go. And I think he's a great representative of what we're talking about, and also of like being able to get into topics that you are not able to talk about anywhere else in life, and he is able to go there. So I think he's a great example, Donald. And while we're, I guess to backtrack for a second, one other thing that because we've talked about this before, it's funny because it's true. I always think it's true because it's funny is sometimes how I think more about when I'm on stage, because like, I'll have lots of ideas. I'm like, okay, let's see how a crowd responds to this. And if a room full of people all starts laughing at it, I'm like, aha, so that's true. And like, I don't always know if other, so I know the phrase works the reverse way, but a lot of times when you're on stage as a comedian, I think you're looking for the audience to teach you through laughter when you're like on the gold, or on the crab, as they say in Deadliest Catch. But I can move on unless you had a comment about any of that.
No.
Okay. No. So, because I want to get into this old age, sickness, and death as being sort of like at the heart of Buddhism, and the comedian who I think about, and the bit that comes to my mind is Norm Macdonald, who I love, and Me Doing Stand-Up is the name of a special and an album that he put out probably like 7 years ago or something like that now. And I love it in part because he goes into like death and heart attacks and serial killers and all kinds of like super dark stuff, but he's got such this like aw shucks sort of folksy delivery to him that he kind of you feel like it's not actually anything that's that edgy or dangerous. But like in his opening bit, it's all about death. So I'll butcher it by just kind of reading it, but like so this is what Norm says: I think scientists should look into that whole death thing, because they seem to focus on diseases, and I don't give a fuck about diseases, because they go, we fixed your arthritis, and I go, am I still going to die? And they go, yeah. And I think that's the biggest problem. And he's like, that's why I can't get behind politicians. They're always like, our biggest problem is unemployment. And I'm like, what about getting old and sick and dying? And and then he goes into, I realized my dad died, my grandfather died, my grandfather's grandfather, I think he died. And I come from a long line of death and I fear it a lot. And I think most of us do. And so like, that sounds to me exactly like the Buddha realizing, talking about what he sees when he goes outside the gates of the palace for the first time. I think to me, it's really interesting how it's right there. He's not even like kind of disguising it in jokes. That it is funny when he says it, but it's not even like some setup punchline. It's just like, yeah, all my relatives died. I come from a long line of death. Like, why is that funny? It's just because we never talk about it, I think.
Yeah. You're absolutely right to make that comparison with the story of the life of Buddha, when Buddha the story is that when he was born, there was a prophecy that he would be like this incredible spiritual renunciant leader, or a Vedic king, a great conqueror. And his father wanted him to follow in his footsteps. So he knew the way to keep him on the straight and narrow was to make his whole world congruent, to never expose him to incongruency. So all he knew was life in a bubble, life at its best. So he never knew old age, sickness, and death until he was like 30, and he went out to see his kingdom for the very first time. It was his first trip out of the bubble, and the Hindu gods intervened because they were all hoping for Buddha's enlightenment. It's kind of a jab at Hinduism. It's the Buddhists saying all those dudes aren't really enlightened anyway, so they need Buddha to get enlightened. So they have the most to lose, because like one of these days they're gonna, the people are gonna figure out those guys aren't enlightened. Anyway, so Buddha goes and leaves the palace and encounters old age, sickness, and death, and doesn't even recognize it. He's like, what the fuck is this? I don't even have a point of reference for cognizing what this is, And when they break it down for him, he's just like, fuck that shit, we don't, who signed on for this deal? This is a bad deal, And he goes back to his dad, and his dad's like, look, man, that's just the way it is. That's how it is. And you might as well make the best of it. And he's like, I don't really see that. No, I kind of feel like maybe we should try to do something about that death thing, because if you can solve that, then all this other stuff doesn't matter. So old age, sickness, and death, if you can solve the death part, then, you're home free. And Buddha then goes and gets enlightened, lives to be a ripe old age, and then, gets sick and dies.
That's what happens.
Yeah. So that's
he's okay with it though, right?
Well, see, that's the really interesting question. Is like, what does Buddha mean? Because Buddha says, like Siddhartha says, he's like, I'm going to conquer death. And that's what he claims he does. And that's what Buddhism says they're going to do. They are, when you get enlightened, you are deathless. You transcend rebirth. Like life and death are no longer relevant concepts. So, what is that? So what does it mean to then say Buddha died of old age, sickness? He died of food poisoning at an old age. I think what you want to say is, oh, well, what we're talking about are coping mechanisms for our inherent demise. And what Buddhism does is give you tools for mindfulness and mental stabilization that basically just make all that other hard shit easier to swallow. Gotcha. And it's not this more radical, heroic, thing. And the problem is, I think both are wrong. But I want to be on the heroic side more than I want to be on that other side. I think they're both wrong, because what we're talking about is a completely, it's like anything really, right? Like, how do you describe mushrooms to somebody who hasn't taken them? How do you describe sex to somebody who hasn't had it? How do you describe old age to a fucking college student? That's why I had to bring Louis C.K. in to make everybody get it. You have to experience it, right? So I think
it reminds me of that speech that Robin Williams gives in Good Will Hunting to Matt Damon, where he's like, yeah, you can look at the Sistine Chapel in a book, but you have to go there and actually see it, telling him you have to have these experiences of living and go out into the wild and do things that are uncomfortable, because otherwise you're never actually engaging with reality in the way that leads to true enlightenment.
Right. And I think by definition, we're going to get it wrong most of the time when we try to figure that out. So if enlightenment is not, if if enlightenment is not simply just a coping mechanism, and it's also not this more heroic, I've conquered death and I'm going to live forever, because we know how that movie ends, right? Nobody really wants to be immortal. That's not a good idea. We've seen that movie before, like it doesn't work. It gets either like you're imprisoned in just the same drama all the time, or you start to fall apart and there's no end to you.
Or you're a vampire.
Right. I mean,
which comes with its own set of problems, really,
So the middle way between these two things is this: that's the part that we don't have it's that whole cognitive closure thing. You can't imagine what it's like to be a bat. You can't imagine the middle between. We can't get to the gray between black and white in this context. And what I mean by that is we're talking about, the main enchilada. It's our egos. It's our lives, and so, I think the more you can become tolerant of the incongruencies and uncertainties in life, the more you get to that subjectivity of enlightenment. And even then, though, I think you kind of have to go and ask backward, because your compass is inherently going to be wrong regardless.
And you're an animal that just is innately in your DNA
afraid of animal.
Well, you're afraid of dying. You fear like things that are going to hurt you. It's just like your natural state of being. So you talk about incongruity. You're at war with yourself a little bit to not behave like a squirrel all the time who's like constantly terrified of everything that's coming at you. But also you don't want to be like not afraid of anything, because then you'll just walk into traffic.
Totally. Exactly.
So let me go. I want to go back to the Norm Macdonald thing for a second, because I think he's got an interesting philosophy about how he does comedy. So the line he does in the beginning of that special is, "My dad died, my grandfather died, my grandfather's grandfather, I think he died. So I come from a long line of death, and so I fear it. I fear it a lot, and I think most of us do." Like, outside of the realm of comedy, like that's just like a straight shot. That's not like a setup punchline. And so and he's given interviews in the past, and he talks about when he was the host of Weekend Update on SNL, and he's like, "I did an experiment where I tried to strip all cleverness from the joke and try and make it as blunt as possible. I always told everybody the perfect joke would be this, where the setup and punchline were identical." And to me, that's a fascinating concept. And it kind of reminds me of, like, I don't know that much about Zen koans and like what is the sound of one hand clapping and all that stuff, but it seems almost like it's a similar mentality. Does that resonate with you at all?
It did the moment you said it, and I started trying to think of like it had that cyclical kind of falling back on itself. And I think that's exactly what I mean by like having to go into it ass backwards, is that like you're trying so hard to find the humor, you're trying so hard to find enlightenment, but it is a subjectivity that you've never accessed before, and so it's so radically different that you can't rely really on anything you've relied on before to find it, and that's also where I think humor is really profound, because it's kind of what you were saying about truth. Like there's something, humor, there's something pure about humor. There's something inherently, strangely moral about humor, despite all of Louis', transgressions, like his humor, if we just approach him as an artist, like his humor is always dirty. It's always dirty. And yet there was always something really warm and wholesome feeling about it.
I think humanity, there was a sense of humanity there.
And I remember saying that to my former mother-in-law, and she just looked at me like I was a deranged maniac or something. But yeah, so I you're absolutely right. It's a koan. And Norm Macdonald is a great, I think, example of walking in congruency, like his whole folksy, like packaging is incongruent with the like darkness, you know, that he is sharing. You know, that joke he does about the serial killer is so, that's exactly what I mean. Like you're going along with that, and you are, it's almost like listening to Prairie Home Companion or something. You know, you're like woebegone, but like, you know, he's murdering this woman in a cabin, and he's, you know, it's really, really beautiful and amazing. And
Yeah, like
that to me is great comedy. Yeah.
Yeah, he's so folksy and likable. And you talk about incongruity. He's like, he's got this very aw shucks, I don't know what I'm doing persona, but he's a master of the art form and also a very like deep philosophical guy who reads like Russian literature and philosophy and other things. And so I think you've got that incongruity of like how he is presenting himself on stage and just in general to the world versus, you know, the depthfulness of thought going into what he does, which is, you know, he's one of these people who other comedians all love and like are fascinated by. You know, I don't know if he's had necessarily the mainstream success as some other people, but as comedians who are, you know, who's a comics comic, and he'll often come up. And I think, you know, that mentality also, there's a Stephen Wright quote that I love, which is how he views comedy as seeing the world through the eyes of a child, but using the words of an adult.
Wow.
And I think that ties into some of that sort of, I call it Zen koan because I don't really know what else to call it, but sort of this beginner's mind, maybe, of as a Buddhist concept of, you know, how are you trying to approach things as if you've never seen them before, you've never done them before, and stay in touch with that mode of reacting and thinking about things. And I think that's embedded in that notion of like, how would a little kid who's never encountered this view it? And then if you can say it out loud as an adult on a stage, like a lot of times that will get a laugh, but it's hard to do. You got to kind of, you know, reverse engineer it in a way, or remember what it was like to see something for the first time. Like there's a Seinfeld joke about the commercials that show blood stains on laundry. Like Tide will get out blood stains, and they'll show like a shirt that has like a blood stain. And, you know, Seinfeld's joke is like, I think that's maybe not your big problem is laundry. If you've got a blood stain covering your entire chest, maybe you need to go to the emergency room and worry about the laundry later. And so I think that's just a great example of like, if like we're just so used to seeing that Tide commercial that we don't even process it. But like, imagine if you're like an alien or a child who's never like experienced this thing before, and you see like, whoa, that guy just has blood all over him. Who's caring about laundry right now? You know, it's like this great sort of insight into how a lot of comedy works.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because that is a way of just that some teachers have described enlightenment. You know, that it's like the mind of, you know, it's sort of you're approaching things with a kind of childlike openness, and but you're not innocent in the sense that like you do actually, you know, you have bitten from the tree of knowledge and you are totally aware, but your sort of approach is with the kind of openness that we only associate with children because they don't fucking know better, you know?
Well, or it hasn't been conditioned out of them. Like right. maybe like literally they do know better, and then society and their parents and everyone else keeps whacking at them until it's bled dry.
Well, that's just it. I mean, I think, you know, they're your survival traits, and then there are your spiritual traits. And survival in this sense is like, you know, propagation of the species, right? And so I think those traits are actually incongruent with spiritual traits. Survival as a person, as like a, you know, a spiritual being, that's a different kind of survival, you know? But I think that's partly why it, you know, I say Buddhism is disruptive and real spirituality is like hard and kind of scary, and it's like a bad trip or something in that sense, you know, because it really should be, you know, if it's going against everything that you've been sort of conditioned, you know.
One of the other things that you mentioned in your teaching, when you talk about Buddha's reaction to seeing the sick, and talk about the cause of suffering is the tendency to deny the reality of the human condition and cling to unreal notions about oneself and the world. And I'm curious, how do you see that overlapping with comedy?
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of what we've just been talking about all this time, is that, like, it's about incongruencies. And so, a good comedian is able, I think, to read their audience, and somehow magically, like, intuit, like, their comfort zone, because I think in this sense, what I mean by good comedy is dark comedy, and it really is what you were describing before. I think, it's like you're guiding like a shaman, people's consciousnesses through different, like, jokes that are unsettling, that are exposing incongruencies, that are exposing what Buddhists talk about in that second noble truth, the sort of clinging thing, and that can go tragically wrong. That can go also into wellness, and it can even potentially, I think, put somebody in a kind of mystical state, both in terms of the comedian and the person, receiving the experience.
Yeah, it's interesting, the incongruity thing, because I think a lot of times what it is this spotlight on things that we are all thinking and or feeling, but not talking about. So there is that incongruity there, but it's almost the comedian is almost like the detective showing up with a spotlight and pulling it out and showing it to everyone in the room. It's like, hey, how come we haven't been talking about this? Right. We all knew it was there, but we weren't talking about it. And so it's almost like the comedian isn't always being the incongruity, but they're almost like the incongruity detective who's there to show you the evidence.
Facilitators of incongruency.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to bring up was there's comedians in cars getting coffee with Gary Shandling along with Jerry Seinfeld, and it was right before Gary Shandling passed away. And I do think, have you watched the Shandling documentary on HBO?
I haven't. I really should.
You really have to, because it's the Zen Diaries of Gary Shandling, and it talks a lot about his sort of pursuit of Buddhism, and all his diaries have a lot of sort of the examples I gave of Stephen Wright and Norm Macdonald. Like, Gary was definitely thinking along similar lines of, like, what is the sort of Platonic ideal of comedy, and how do you form it, and how does Buddhism and his belief in it inform the way he approaches comedy. So I think you'd be into it. But to go to
really interesting.
Yeah, the Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee has a great exchange between Jerry and Gary, where Jerry goes, they're talking about David Brennan, who passed away, and Jerry's like, all that material he worked so hard on is just gone. It doesn't mean anything to anyone anymore, and it took so much work for him to create it. And Gary goes, that material and your material is purely a vehicle for you to express your spirit and your soul and your being, and that's why you're fantastic. And Jerry's like, so it doesn't have any value beyond that? And Gary's like, it doesn't have any value beyond you expressing yourself spiritually. It's why you're on the planet. And it's this great exchange where Jerry is clearly like, but it's material. It's got to be worth something. And Gary is like, it's the way to, it's everything. It's the way to express yourself spiritually. And it's why you're on the planet. And it's this great exchange. And I guess I'm curious about, like, the purpose of the comedian in going out there and generating this material and expressing it. Is that, sort of, are there Buddhist notions tied up in that?
Are there Buddhist notions tied up in what?
In that desire to express yourself that way, and to view this, material and art form as a vehicle for expressing what he calls your spirit and your soul and your being.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, what I heard when you were telling that story was, like, the emptiness of the object, and sort of like showing somebody, that value is ascribed based on, what we give it, and that, like, what an object is worth is arbitrary, really, and that's a way of talking about its lack of intrinsic value, its lack of intrinsic existence, its emptiness, and when you're talking to somebody who is very materially oriented, like maybe they are in the business of buying and selling material objects, like that sort of the natural epistemology, I think, for somebody whose everyday existence is in the buying and selling of physical objects, like that makes you a strong materialist. And if you don't have any reason to ever challenge your core assumptions about reality, like you would really be cognitively challenged to try to understand the emptiness of the value of those things that you're moving every day and is paying for your kids' college and paying for the rent and all the things that you defined life by, right?
Yeah, and I think you look at Jerry and Gary and the amount of money that they both made from doing comedy, you probably see those different attitudes reflected in it.
Yeah, and that's the thing about money. Like, money can, push you into, I think, a kind of realization of emptiness where it's like suddenly you've got so much of it. It's like, what the fuck? Like, what is money? And I'm still miserable, like it does nothing. And you're just like, it's this paper. And you kind of like have this realization of like the ridiculousness of like money, even though it's obviously not ridiculous. It's a very important conventional truth that pays the rent and all that. But then there's the other flip side where you get so much power, you get kind of drunk on power, and you actually see, rich people who are like penny pinching and like crazy, like keeping everything, like trying to hold on to that sense of congruency, like it's not all, empty.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's funny what money does. I mean, I don't have a lot myself, but
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a good ending point for us also, as we were talking about Jerry Seinfeld and money. He's got more money than, almost any other entertainer on the planet, does not need to, do anything he doesn't want to do, is set for life, and yet is still out there touring, playing comedy venues all the time, which I think is kind of fascinating, that he wants to be in, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then Iowa City, and then, Tulsa, and like that. This man who could be doing anything and just sitting around in his like vintage Ferraris or whatever is like, still wanting on some level more than anything else to be, on that stage doing that thing that I think, what Gary Shandling was talking about to him, like, even if he didn't get it in the moment, I think on some level he does get that it's, an avenue for him to express. I mean, he would hate anyone talking about his soul or spirituality, but like whatever he has to deliver to the planet, I think, he recognizes that. And on some level, the way the Buddha didn't want to just stay in his gilded palace, that there's, you can have it all, but eventually you might still want to go beyond those riches to get to something more real.
Amen.
All right. Well, wonderful chat. I feel like we've got much more that we can dive into on this, so we'll have to do it again sometime, but I think we covered some good ground here.
All right, brother. And if anybody's in New York City, and Psychedelic Sangha is doing live in-person psychedelic integration at Judson Memorial Church this evening at 7:00.
Ooh, tell me again, what is that? Where is it happening? What's going on?
So you can go to our website, psychedelicsangha.org, and there's we're also on Instagram, and it's our monthly psychedelic integration circle that we do, and it's an in-person event, and you have to register, but it's free, and it's peer-to-peer support for psychedelic trauma. So if you've had a bad trip or just a trip you want to integrate into your life, you come to our circle, and you are supported and validated by a circle of peers. And it's not a lecturer or guru kind of thing. It's just peer-to-peer support, no professionals.
Great. Sounds intriguing. And yeah, I'll just plug my newsletter again because I've been spending lots of effort on it. Every Tuesday, the Rubes letter comes out. You can sign up at mattruby.substack.com. And I'll be doing more live streams like this, and I'll have Chris back on to talk more about Buddhism and dark comedy. And thanks everyone for watching. Chris, thanks for doing it. And I guess we'll sign off now.
Well, thank you.